If you actually care about your relationship and want it to last, don't make these three communication mistakes that I see people make all the time. As a therapist, a lot of people come talk to me when they're struggling with communication. And when I talk to couples about communication, there are often three recurring problems that I see the most. And I want to talk to you about those today and tell you what you can do instead. So, the number one thing that I see is over communicating, or put a different way, being a verbal processor. And what I mean by this is that verbal processors are people who, again, verbally process what they're thinking. So they don't always know what they think or feel until they've said it to somebody. And then in saying it to someone, it becomes more clear and they kind of decide, well, I'm going to take that or I'll leave that, or this is actually what I meant by that. But they really don't know what they think, feel, want, or need until they bounce it off someone. So, why is this a challenge in a relationship? Well, this is a challenge in a relationship because occasionally that person who is verbally processing something actually says something that's really, really hurtful to their partner, and they decide later they don't mean it. But the thing is this is even if you don't mean it later, you still said it. So if you go to your person and you say, hey, I was just kind of thinking lately about you've really been a jerk the last couple of weeks, or I've been thinking about you're really no good at this, or I wish you were this way. Sometimes we say very hurtful things that we don't even necessarily mean, but it's all for trying to process with our person. And because they're our person, we often look to them to do this. And so what happens is that our person is usually all about it, provided it's about someone or something else, right? You can verbally process about any other thing, but the minute that it's personal, it gets really hard to say, oh, they were just processing through it. When they said that really hurtful thing, I'm sure they didn't mean it. They actually, they were just figuring it out. It's really hard to show up in that place and be objective and to not be biased. And so, what I want you to see is if you're a person who's a verbal processor, you can do the same thing, but with journaling. And so, what I mean by that is you can journal out, or you can actually even voice note or record what you're thinking or feeling and listen back to it and then decide what to say, or then decide what you think and feel about a situation. Because if you don't do this, you do run the risk of having conversations and having hurt and pain and betrayal about things that you don't actually even mean. And so, what I tell you is no problem being a verbal processor, but if it comes to be about your person in particular or about how you think, feel, or want to approach them, I think what I would tell you is this: anything that matters in life, any important conversation, we want to show up prepared for. And so we want to show up prepared for that conversation by knowing what we think, knowing what we feel, knowing what we need and what we want. And when we know those things, we can actually have really great communication because it's pretty simple. We can be succinct and to the point. And even if it's a hard thing, if we're clear on what that thing is, people will often listen to us. The part that's just hurtful is when we lack clarity and we sort of drag somebody through the process of figuring it out. So if you're an over communicator or you're a verbal processor that finds yourself in this habit, just understand there's nothing wrong with being a verbal processor. Just with your person, you have to process it differently. Now, you might have noticed, why didn't I say call and tell a friend all the things you're thinking about your partner? Well, that's probably not their job either, and also not going to give great advice or great feedback. And so, if you're in this position and you really need to talk to somebody, you might talk to a mentor or a therapist or someone who does this professionally to help you sort through and sift through your ideas and feelings so you know what you actually think and feel. Okay, number two, the biggest mistake that I see in communication is that couples don't talk about it until they have to talk about it. And so what I mean by this is they set up a relationship and they set the bar really, really high on things we're going to have a conversation about or things we're willing to communicate about. And so for a lot of these couples in this place, they just sort of self-regulate, they go about their day. They're just not saying a whole lot of things, but the thing is that if the bar is really high for what justifies a conversation or what mandates a conversation, it means it's got to get really, really bad before we talk. And guess what? If you're not good at talking often and then you wait till it gets really bad to talk, how well do you think that's going to go? Well, obviously not very well, because again, you're not practiced at it. And so we kind of have the opposite problem here, where in the first example, we're over communicating. In the second example, we're under communicating. We're actually just saying, like, we're going to make it so that nothing really warrants a conversation. But what I'll tell you about the healthiest couples that I know is they talk about it and they talk often. And that's not to say they walk around and they pick a fight. They say, "Hey, what are you looking at? This is my problem." They don't do that, but they also don't internalize and push down things that are hard, things that are difficult, things that were hurtful. They just process through them. And so they know how to repair. And so if you're in a relationship where you come in and you talk to me and you go, "Yeah, we just have always gotten along forever and it's been years and years of being so amazing." And then all of a sudden, now we're talking and we don't agree on anything and it's awful and terrible and we're thinking about splitting. Well, I'm not surprised because you lost each other along the way. And I think sometimes this comes from when we're kids and we have parents that we just never saw fight or we never saw have a difficult conversation or work towards resolution. What it communicates to us is either you don't have it or there's some magical, mysterious thing that takes place that we don't know how to do. And so we naturally avoid it because it's just not our skill set. And so if this is you, I'm not saying you have to blame your childhood, but I'm saying this avoidance of conversation comes from something or somewhere, and it has to do with some expectations and some experiences. And we just have to adjust the bar for what requires conversation. So instead of saying, "Hey, you know what, we're only going to talk about it if it's so bad we have to," we're going to set that a little differently. We're going to say, we're going to talk about it if this is something that, a couple days have gone by and we're not moving past. Or we're going to talk about it if I feel strongly about it, but I'm going to sleep on it first. So we just need to make up some new rules about what it is that we communicate about and what we won't communicate about. And then lastly, number three, and this is one you could probably guess by now, is I see a lot of couples who do a lot of talking or not a lot of talking, but when the talking counts, they don't actually know where to go with it. So they just sort of talk and the other person listens, and then we're still stuck with the difficult thing. And so, what this means in relationships is if we don't know how to actually work through it, we're just sort of stuck in what I would call problem awareness. And the thing about problem awareness is it's actually a pretty easy place to get to because, most people understand the problem. That's rarely the thing that people are missing out on. When people come to see me and I say, "Hey, why are you here? What was the catalyst for contacting me? What's the problem?" Very rarely do I get someone who's like, "Well, I don't know. I don't really know what the problem is," or "I'm completely confused about this." Now, they might need to clarify that, but they know the problem. And so the easiest thing to do is point out the problem. Lots of couples can do that. But here's what is difficult and different is that healthy couples can point out the problem, they can acknowledge, they can accept, they can take responsibility, and they can repair. Now, the and repair part is really important. And so is the acknowledgement and acceptance of it. And so if you're stuck in your relationship at problem awareness, it's going to be pretty negative most of the time because we're human and we mess up. I'm definitely not a perfect partner. Even though I've got all this experience as a therapist, I mess up a lot. And so if all we do is look at the other person through the lens of what's the problem, we will always find something. And so what we have to learn to do as a couple is number one, decide what problems require our attention versus what problems are actually just ongoing problems, or as I might call them, annoyances. Dr. John Gottman talked a little bit about most couples, and it's a high percentage, they have this high percentage of conflict that's just always going to be there because they're two different people. And so our decision making process is what of this conflict is just us being who we are that's a bit annoying and we'll get through it. And then what about this is something that actually needs to change while understanding that change is difficult. And so if we get into a place where we go, okay, this actually needs to change, Jason, this isn't just like I'm annoyed, it's that can't continue to happen or I won't be putting up with this. Then what we need to do instead is we need to figure out, okay, how do we actually negotiate? How do we navigate that conversation and end up making some decisions for the betterment of the relationship that actually honor who we are, what we value, and the relationship itself? Because where a lot of couples go wrong is, again, they acknowledge the problem. They maybe even have some acceptance and some ownership about, yep, this is my role in the problem, or this is my part. This is where I made a misstep. But what they're not usually good at is saying, okay, what do I actually need to walk away from this conversation feeling like they get it? And so that's a prompt I'll give somebody is like, what do you need to hear right now? Or what could be said or done that would reflect that the other person gets it so you can move on? And if you don't know what that is, don't use the other person to figure that out. You have to figure out for yourself because that's another problem in conflict is trying to get the other person to figure out what you want and they're bad mind readers and bad guessers. So these three things, if you can get better at, number one, not over talking and verbally processing, number two, not avoiding conversations, and then number three, learning how to actually work through conflict and difficult conversations, you are putting yourself so far ahead of most relationships in the sense of you can actually work through things. And so one thing's for certain is that in relationship there will be things, but if you can do those things and you're mindful about it and you have the ability to communicate, you can weather that storm. You can get through that. And so that's my hope for you, is that hearing these things today, maybe it spurs you to take change. Maybe it tells you you're doing really well. Maybe it makes you think about a relationship you had that you wish were different. Maybe you hear yourself in a lot of these and it's time for some change. Wherever it meets you, just know that this is the message for you today and take the next right step.